Good afternoon and welcome back to Cecilia. I'm here with a special bumper edition in which I'm going to read you 3 whole chapters, a full 20 pages of The Brick. I have to admit that I am in an absolutely foul mood today and I'm feeling so tense and stressed that I can feel my muscles physically contracting from it. So even though it's a little earlier than I would normally read, I figured that I would just start reading and probably read for over half an hour, and hopefully by the time I'm done I will feel less like punching a hole in the wall. At least that's the plan. And looking ahead in the book, I also realised that if I read 3 chapters tonight, then that means tomorrow I can read one of my favourite chapters in the entire novel and one of the most memorable. So that gives us motivation. It's also a really, really long chapter tomorrow. So if I don't read 3 chapters tonight, I'm going to get all out of sync and it's all going to be very confusing. So I have my elderflower cordial. It's sunny outside. I hope you are well and not feeling your muscles tense up in spasms of irritation, frustration and anxiety. And if they are, for whatever reason, I hope that being taken away into the world of Frances Burney will have a similar effect on them that I hope it is going to have on me. Chapter 11. A Narration. The moment Cecilia was at liberty, she sent her own servant to examine into the real situation of the carpenter and his family, and to desire his wife would call upon her as soon as she was at leisure. The account which he brought back increased her concern for the injuries of these poor people, and determined her not to rest satisfied till she saw them redressed. He informed her that they lived in a small lodging up 2 pairs of stairs, that there were 5 children, all girls, the 3 eldest of whom were hard at work with their mother in matting chair bottoms, and the 4th, though a mere child, was nursing the youngest, while the poor carpenter himself was confined to his bed, and in consequence of a fall from a ladder while working at Violet Bank, by which he was covered with wounds and contusions, and an object of misery and pain. As soon as Mrs. Hill came, Cecilia sent for her into her own room, where she received her with the most compassionate tenderness, and desired to know when Mr. Harrel talked of paying her. "Tomorrow, madam," she answered, shaking her head. "That is always his honour's speech, but I shall bear it while I can. However, though I dare not tell his honour, something bad will come of it if I am not paid soon." "Do you mean then to apply to the law?" "I must not tell you, madam, but to be sure we have thought of it many a sad time and often, but still, while we could rub on, we thought it best not to make enemies. But indeed, madam, his honour was so hard-hearted this morning, that if I was not afraid you would be angry, I could not tell how to bear it. For when I told him I had no help now, for I had lost my Billy, he had the heart to say, 'So much the better, there's one the less of you.'" "But what," cried Cecilia, extremely shocked by this unfeeling speech, "is the reason he gives for disappointing you so often?" "He says, madam, that none of the other workmen are paid yet, and that, to be sure, is very true. But then they can all better afford to wait than we can, for we were the poorest of all, madam, and have been misfortunate from the beginning, and his honour would never have employed us, only he had run up such a bill with Mr. Wright that he would not undertake anything more till he was paid. We were told from the first we should not get our money, but we were willing to hope for the best, for we had nothing to do and were hard run, and had never had the offer of so good a job before, and we had a great family to keep, and many losses and so much illness. Oh, madam, if you did but know what the poor go through." This speech opened to Cecilia a new view of life. That a young man could appear so gay and happy, yet be guilty of such injustice and inhumanity, that he could take pride in works which not even money had made his own, and live with undiminished splendour when his credit itself began to fail, seemed to her incongruities so irrational that hitherto she had supposed them impossible. She then inquired if her husband had yet had any physician. "Yes, ma'am, I humbly thank your goodness," she answered, "but I am not the poorer for that, for the gentleman was so kind he would take nothing." "And does he give you any hopes? What does he say?" "He says he must die, madam, but I knew that before." "Poor woman! And what will you do then?" "The same, madam, as I did when I lost my Billy. Work on the harder." "Good heaven, how severe a lot! But tell me, why is it you seem to love your Billy so much better than the rest of your children?" "Because, madam, he was the only boy that ever I had. He was 17 years old, madam, and as tall and as pretty a lad, and so good, that he never cost me a wet eye till I lost him. He worked with his father, and all the folks used to say he was the better workman of the two." "And what was the occasion of his death?" "A consumption, madam, that wasted him quite to nothing. And he was ill a long time, and cost us a deal of money, for we spared neither for wine nor anything that we thought would but comfort him, and we loved him so we never grudged it. But he died, madam, and if it had not been for very hard work, the loss of him would quite have broke my heart." "Try, however, to think less of him," said Cecilia, "and depend upon my speaking again for you to Mr Harrel. You shall certainly have your money. Take care, therefore, of your own health, and go home and give comfort to your sick husband." "Oh, madam," cried the poor woman, tears streaming down her cheeks, "you don't know how touching it is to hear gentlefolks talk so kindly, and I have been used to nothing but roughness from his honour. But what I most fear, madam, is that when my husband is gone, he will be harder to deal with than ever, for a widow, madam, is always hard to be righted, and I don't expect to hold out long myself, for sickness and sorrow wear fast. And then when we are both gone, who is to help our poor children?" "I will," cried Cecilia, generously. "I am able and I am willing. You shall not find all the rich hard-hearted, and I will try to make you some amends for the unkindnesses you have suffered." The poor woman, overcome by a promise so unexpected, burst into a passionate fit of tears, and sobbed out her thanks with a violence of emotion that frightened Cecilia almost as much as it melted her. She endeavoured by reiterated assurances of assistance to appease her, and solemnly pledged her own honour that she should certainly be paid the following Saturday, which was only 3 days distant. Mrs Hill, when a little calmer, dried her eyes, and humbly begging her to forgive a transport which she could not restrain, most gratefully thanked her for the engagement into which she had entered, protesting that she would not be troublesome to her goodness, as long as she could help it. "And I believe," she continued, "that if his honour will but pay me time enough for the burial, I can make shift with what I have till then. But when my poor Billy died, we were sadly off indeed, for we could not bear but bury him prettily, because it was the last we could do for him. But we could hardly scrape up enough for it, and yet we all went without our dinners to help forward, except the little one of all. But that did not much matter, for we had no great heart for eating." "I cannot bear this," cried Cecilia. "You must tell me no more of your Billy, but go home and cheer your spirits, and do everything in your power to save your husband." "I will, madam," answered the woman, "and his dying prayers shall bless you, and all my children shall bless you, and every night they shall pray for you. And oh," again bursting into tears, "that Billy was but alive to pray for you too." Cecilia kindly endeavoured to soothe her, but the poor creature, no longer able to suppress the violence of her awakened sorrows, cried out, "I must go, madam, and pray for you at home, for now I have once again begun crying, I don't know how to be done," and hurried away. Cecilia determined to make once more an effort with Mr Harrel for the payment of the bill, and if that in 2 days did not succeed, to take up money for the discharge of it herself, and rest all her security for reimbursement upon the shame with which such a proceeding must overwhelm him. Offended, however, by the repulse she had already received from him, and disgusted by all she had heard of his unfeeling negligence, she knew not how to address him, and resolved upon applying again to Mr Arnott, who was already acquainted with the affair, for advice and assistance. Mr Arnott, though extremely gratified that she consulted him, betrayed by his looks a hopelessness of success that damped all her expectations. He promised, however, to speak to Mr Harrel upon the subject, but the promise was evidently given to oblige the fair mediatrix, without any hope of advantage to the cause. The next morning Mrs Hill again came, and again without payment was dismissed. Mr Arnott then, at the request of Cecilia, followed Mr Harrel into his room to inquire into the reason of this breach of promise. They continued some time together, and when he returned to Cecilia, he told her that his brother had assured him he would give orders to Davison, his gentleman, to let her have the money the next day. The pleasure with which she would have heard this intelligence was much checked by the grave and cold manner in which it was communicated. She waited therefore with more impatience than confidence for the result of this fresh assurance. The next morning, however, was the same as the last. Mrs. Hill came, saw Davison, and was sent away. Cecilia, to whom she related her grievances, then flew to Mr. Arnott and entreated him to inquire at least of Davison why the woman had again been disappointed. Mr. Arnott obeyed her, and brought for answer that Davison had received no orders from his master. "I entreat you, then," cried she, with mingled eagerness and vexation, "to go for the last time to Mr. Harrel. I am sorry to impose upon you an office so disagreeable, but I am sure you compassionate these poor people, and will serve them now with your interest, as you have already done with your purse. I only wish to know if there has been any mistake, or if these delays are merely to sicken me of petitioning." Mr. Arnott, with a repugnance to the request which he could as ill conceal as his admiration of the zealous requester, again forced himself to follow Mr. Harrel. His stay was not long, and Cecilia at his return perceived that he was hurt and disconcerted. As soon as they were alone together, she begged to know what had passed. "Nothing," answered he, "that will give you any pleasure. When I entreated my brother to come to the point, he said it was his intention to pay all his workmen together, for that if he paid any one singly, all the rest would be dissatisfied." "And why," said Cecilia, "should he not pay them at once? There can be no more comparison in the value of the money to him and to them, than, to speak the truth, there is in his and in their right to it." "But, madam, the bills for the new house itself are none of them settled, and he says that the moment he is known to discharge an account for the Temple, he shall not have any rest for the clamours it will raise among the workmen who are employed about the house." "How infinitely strange!" exclaimed Cecilia. "Will he not then pay anybody?" "Next quarter, he says, he shall pay them all, but at present he has a particular call for his money." Cecilia would not trust herself to make any comments upon such an avowal, but thanking Mr. Arnott for the trouble which he had taken, she determined, without any further application, to desire Mr. Harrel to advance her £20 the next morning, and satisfy the carpenter herself, be the risk what it might. The following day, therefore, which was the Saturday when payment was promised, she begged an audience of Mr. Harrel, which he immediately granted, but before she could make her demand, he said to her with an air of the utmost gaiety and good humour, "Well, Miss Beverley, how fares it with your protégée? I hope at length she is contented, but I must beg you would charge her to keep her own counsel, as otherwise she will draw me into a scrape I shall not thank her for." "Have you then paid her?" cried Cecilia, with much amazement. "Yes, I promised you I would, you know." This intelligence equally delighted and astonished her. She repeatedly thanked him for his attention to her petition, and eager to communicate her success to Mr. Arnott, she hastened to find him. "Now," cried she, "I shall torment you no more with painful commissions. The Hills at last are paid." "From you, madam," answered he gravely, "no commissions could be painful." "Well, but," said Cecilia, somewhat disappointed, "you don't seem glad of this." "Yes," answered he with a forced smile, "I am very glad to see you so." "But how was it brought about? Did Mr. Harrel relent, or did you attack him again?" The hesitation of his answer convinced her there was some mystery in the transaction. She began to apprehend she had been deceived, and hastily quitting the room, sent for Mrs. Hill. But the moment the poor woman appeared, she was satisfied of the contrary, for, almost frantic with joy and gratitude, she immediately flung herself upon her knees to thank her benefactress for having seen her righted. Cecilia then gave her some general advice, promised to continue her friend, and offered her assistance in getting her husband into a hospital. But she told her he had already been in one many months, where he had been pronounced incurable, and therefore was desirous to spend his last days in his own lodgings. "Well," said Cecilia, "make them as easy to him as you can, and come to me next week, and I will try to put you in a better way of living." She then, still greatly perplexed about Mr. Arnott, sought him again, and after various questions and conjectures, at length brought him to confess he had himself lent his brother the sum with which the Hills had been paid. Struck with his generosity, she poured forth thanks and praises so grateful to his ears, that she soon gave him a recompense which he would have thought cheaply purchased by half his fortune. And in fact, that is the end of Book 1 of Cecilia. Book 1 of Volume 1, Volume 1 containing 2 books, Volume 2 containing 2 books, Volume 3 containing 2 books, Volume 4 containing 2 books, and Volume 5 containing 2 books. So we can now say that we are, 5 volumes with 10 books. We are now 10% through Cecilia. Are you feeling a bit more relaxed? I'm feeling a bit more relaxed. Now, I can't say this chapter has particularly improved my view of the world we live in. Book 2 opens with 2 chapters, which you might like to contrast with each other, as Cecilia meets her other 2 guardians. So, very important new characters. Book 2, Chapter 1, A Man of Wealth. The meanness with which Mr. Harrel had assumed the credit, as well as accepted the assistance of Mr. Arnold, increased the disgust he had already excited in Cecilia, and hastened her resolution of quitting his house, and therefore, without waiting any longer for the advice of Mr. Monckton, she resolved to go instantly to her other guardians, and see what better prospects their habitations might offer. For this purpose, she borrowed one of the carriages, and gave orders to be driven into the city, to the house of Mr. Briggs. She told her name, and was shown by a little shabby footboy into a parlour. Here she waited with tolerable patience for half an hour. But then, imagining the boy had forgotten to tell his master she was in the house, she thought it expedient to make some inquiry. No bell, however, could she find, and therefore she went into the passage in search of the footboy. But as she was proceeding to the head of the kitchen stairs, she was startled by hearing a man's voice from the upper part of the house, exclaiming in a furious passion, "Dare say you filched it for a dish-clout!" She called out, however, "Are any of Mr. Briggs' servants below?" "Annan," answered the boy, who came to the foot of the stairs with a knife in one hand and an old shoe upon the sole of which he was sharpening it in the other. "Does anyone call?" "Yes," said Cecilia, "I do, for I could not find the bell." "Oh, we have no bell in the parlour," returned the boy. "Master always knocks with his stick." "I am afraid Mr. Briggs is too busy to see me, and if so, I will come another time." "No, ma'am," said the boy. "Master's only looking over his things from the wash." "Will you tell him, then, that I am waiting?" "I has, madam, but master misses his shaving rag, and he says he won't come till the Mogul till he's found it." And then he went on with sharpening his knife. This little circumstance was at least sufficient to satisfy Cecilia that if she fixed her abode with Mr. Briggs, she should not have much uneasiness to fear from the sight of extravagance and profusion. She returned to the parlour, and after waiting another half-hour, Mr. Briggs made his appearance. Mr. Briggs was a short, thick, sturdy man, with very small, keen black eyes, a square face, a dark complexion, and a snub nose. His constant dress, both in winter and summer, was a snuff-coloured suit of clothes, blue and white speckled worsted stockings, a plain skirt, and a bob wig. He was seldom without a stick in his hand, which he usually held to his forehead when not speaking. This bob wig, however, to the no small amazement of Cecilia, he now brought into the room upon the forefinger of his left hand, while his right was in smoothing the curls, and his head, in defiance of the coldness of the weather, was bald and uncovered. "Well?" cried he as he entered. Well, that has never happened before in all the time I've been reading Evelina and Cecilia, that somebody should call me on Skype for, I should say, a regular planned chat that in my irritation I had completely forgotten about in the midst of my reading. And I pressed pause. I hope it's worked. I'm going to continue. It seems to be recording, but if you heard the sort of the bongs of Skype, that's what happened. And in fact, although time will not have stopped for you watching, time has in fact progressed a whole 5 or so minutes on for me over here, which just goes to show, as we've already learnt in lockdown, time is an illusion. And now to find out where I got up to, I think it was something about Mr. Briggs's bob wig. So, if there's a little bit of crossover from where I was before, I apologise. and his head, in defiance of the coldness of the weather, was bald and uncovered. "Well," cried he as he entered, "did you think should not come?" "I was very willing, sir, to wait your leisure." "Ay, ay, knew you had not much to do. Been looking for my shaving rag. Going out of town, never use such a thing at home, paper does as well. Warrant Master Harrel never heard of such a thing. Ever seen him comb his own wig? Warrant he don't know how. Never trust mine out of my hands. The boy would tear off half the hair. All one to Master Harrel, I suppose. Well, which is the warmer man, that's all. Will he cast an account with me?" Cecilia, at a loss what to say to this singular exordium, began an apology for not waiting upon him sooner. "Ay, ay," cried he, "always gadding. No getting sight of you. Live a fine life. A pretty guardian, Master Harrel. And where's t'other? Where's old Don Puffabout?" "If you mean Mr Delvile, sir, I have not yet seen him." "Thought so. No matter, as well not. Only tell you he's a German Duke or a Spanish Don Ferdinand. Well, you've me, poorly off else. Couple of ignoramuses, don't know when to buy nor when to sell. No doing business with either of 'em. We met once or twice, all to no purpose. Only heard Don Vampus counted old grandees. How will that get interest for money? Then comes Master Harrel, 20 bows to a word, looks at a watch, about as big as a sixpence. Poor raw ninny, couple of rare guardians. Well, you've me, I say, mind that." Cecilia was wholly unable to devise any answer to these effusions of contempt and anger, and therefore his harangue lasted without interruption, till he had exhausted all his subjects of complaint and emptied his mind of ill will. And then, settling his wig, he drew a chair near her, and twinkling his little black eyes in her face, his rage subsided into the most perfect good humour, and after peering at her for some time with a look of much approbation, he said with an arch nod, "Well, my duck, got ever a sweetheart yet?" Cecilia laughed and said, "No." "Ah, little rogue, don't believe you. All a fib. Better speak out. Come, fit I should know. An't you my own ward?" "To be sure, almost of age, but not quite. So what's that to me?" She then more seriously assured him she had no intelligence of that sort to communicate. "Well, when you have, tell all. Warrant sparks enough hankering. I'll give you some advice. Take care of sharpers. Don't trust shoe buckles, nothing but Bristol stones. Tricks in all things. A fine gentleman sharp as another man. Never give your heart to a gold top cane, nothing but brass gilt over. Cheats everywhere, fleece you in a year, won't leave you a groat, but one way to be safe, bring 'em all to me." Cecilia thanked him for his caution, and promised not to forget his advice. "That's the way," he continued. "Bring 'em to me, won't be bamboozled. Know their tricks, show 'em the odds on't. Ask for the rent roll. See how they'll look, stare like stuck pigs. Got no such thing." "Certainly, sir, that will be an excellent method of trial." "Ay, ay, know the way. Soon find if they are above par. Be sure don't mind gold waistcoats, nothing but tinsel, all show and no substance. Better leave the matter to me. Take care of yourself, you myself. Know where to find one will do." She again thanked him, and being fully satisfied with this specimen of his conversation, and unambitious of any further counsel from him, she rose to depart. "Well," repeated he, nodding at her with a look of much kindness, "leave it to me, I say. I'll get you a careful husband, so take no thought about the matter." Cecilia, half laughing, begged he would not give himself much trouble, and assured him she was not in any haste. "All the better," said he. "Good girl, no fear for you. Look out myself, warrant I'll find one. Not very easy neither. Hard times, men scarce, wars and tumults, stocks low, women chargeable. And don't fear, do our best, get you off soon." She then returned to her carriage, full of reflection upon the scene in which she had just been engaged, and upon the strangeness of hastening from one house to avoid a vice the very want of which seemed to render another insupportable. But she now found that though luxury was more baneful in its consequences, it was less disgustful in its progress than avarice, yet insuperably averse to both, and almost equally desirous to fly from the unjust extravagance of Mr Harrel, as from the comfortless and unnecessary parsimony of Mr Briggs. She proceeded instantly to St James's Square, convinced that her third guardian, unless exactly resembling one or the others, must inevitably be preferable to both. "I wonder if he will be." Briggs is a Dickensian character all through. is he not? And now onwards. Chapter 2. A Man of Family. The house of Mr. Delvile was grand and spacious, fitted up not with modern taste, but with the magnificence of former times. The servants were all veterans, gorgeous in their liveries, and profoundly respectful in their manners. Everything had an air of state, but of a state so gloomy that while it inspired awe, it repressed pleasure. Cecilia sent in her name and was admitted without difficulty, and was then ushered with great pomp through sundry apartments and rows of servants before she came into the presence of Mr. Delvile. He received her with an air of haughty affability, which to a spirit open and liberal as that of Cecilia could not fail of being extremely offensive, but too much occupied with the care of his own importance to penetrate into the feelings of another. He attributed the uneasiness which his reception occasioned to the overawing predominance of superior rank and consequence. He ordered a servant to bring her a chair, while he only half rose from his own upon her entering into the room. Then, waving his hand and bowing, with a motion that desired her to be seated, he said, "I am very happy, Miss Beverley, that you have found me alone. You would rarely have had the same good fortune. At this time of day I am generally in a crowd. People of large connections have not much leisure in London, especially if they see little after their own affairs, and if their estates, like mine, are dispersed in various parts of the kingdom. However, I am glad it happened so. And I am glad, too, that you have done me the favour of calling without waiting till I sent, which I really would have done as soon as I heard of your arrival, but that the multiplicity of my engagements allowed me no respite." A display of importance so ostentatious made Cecilia already half repent her visit, satisfied that the hope in which she had planned it would be fruitless. Mr. Delvile, still imputing to embarrassment an inquietude of countenance that proceeded merely from disappointment, imagined her veneration was every moment increasing, and therefore, pitying a timidity which both gratified and softened him, and equally pleased with himself for inspiring and with her for feeling it, he abated more and more of his greatness, till he became at length so infinitely condescending, with intention to give her courage, that he totally depressed her with mortification and chagrin. After some general inquiries concerning her way of life, he told her that he hoped she was contented with her situation at the Harolds, adding, "If you have anything to complain of, remember to whom you may appeal." He then asked if she had seen Mr. Briggs. "Yes, sir, I am this moment come from his house." "I am sorry for it. His house cannot be a proper one for the reception of a young lady. When the Dean made application that I would be one of your guardians, I instantly sent him a refusal, as is my custom upon all such occasions, which indeed occurred to me with a frequency extremely importunate. But the Dean was a man for whom I had really a regard, and therefore, when I found my refusal had affected him, I suffered myself to be prevailed upon to indulge him, contrary not only to my general rule, but to my inclination." Here he stopped, as if to receive some compliment, but Cecilia, very little disposed to pay him any, went no further than an inclination of her head. "I knew not, however," he continued, "at the time I was induced to give my consent, with whom I was to be associated, nor could I have imagined the Dean so little conversant with the distinctions of the world as to disgrace me with inferior coadjutors. But the moment I learnt the state of the affair, I insisted upon withdrawing both my name and countenance." Here again he paused, not in expectation of an answer from Cecilia, but merely to give her time to marvel in what manner he had at last been melted. "The Dean," he resumed, "was then very ill. My displeasure, I believe, hurt him. I was sorry for it. He was a worthy man, and had not meant to offend me. In the end I accepted his apology, and was even persuaded to accept the office. You have a right, therefore, to consider yourself as personally my ward, and though I do not think proper to mix much with your other guardians, I shall always be ready to serve and advise you, and much pleased to see you." "You do me honour, sir," said Cecilia, extremely wearied of such graciousness, and rising to be gone. "Pray sit still," said he with a smile. "I have not many engagements for this morning. You must give me some account of how you pass your time. Are you much out? The Harrels, I am told, live at a great expense. What is their establishment?" "I don't exactly know, sir." "They are a decent sort of people, I believe, are they not?" "I hope so, sir." "And they have a tolerable acquaintance, I believe. I am told so, for I know nothing of them." "They have at least a very numerous one, sir." "Well, my dear," said he, taking her hand, "now you have ventured to come, don't be apprehensive of repeating your visits. I must introduce you to Mrs. Delvile. I am sure she will be happy to show you any kindness. Come, therefore, when you please, and without scruple. I would call upon you myself, but I am fearful of being embarrassed by the people with whom you live." He then rang his bell, and with the same ceremonies which had attended her admittance, she was conducted back into her carriage. And here died away all hope of putting into execution during her minority the plan of which the formation had given her so much pleasure. She found that her present situation, however wide of her wishes, was by no means the most disagreeable in which she could be placed. She was tired indeed of dissipation, and shocked at the sight of unfeeling extravagance, but notwithstanding the houses of each of her other guardians were exempt from these particular vices, she saw not any prospect of happiness with either of them. Vulgarity seemed leagued with avarice to drive her from the mansion of Mr. Briggs, and haughtiness with ostentation to exclude her from that of Mr. Delvile. She came back therefore to Portman Square, disappointed in her hopes, and sick both of those whom she quitted and of those to whom she was returning. But in going to her own apartment, Mrs. Harrel, eagerly stopping her, begged she would come into the drawing-room, where she promised her a most agreeable surprise. Cecilia, for an instant, imagined that some old acquaintance was just arrived out of the country, but upon her entrance she saw only Mr. Harrel and some workmen, and found that the agreeable surprise was to proceed from the sight of an elegant awning, prepared for one of the inner apartments, to be fixed over a long dessert table, which was to be ornamented with various devices of cut glass. "Did you ever see anything so beautiful in your life?" cried Mrs. Harrel. "And when the table is covered with the coloured ices and those sort of things, it will be as beautiful again. We shall have it ready for Tuesday se'nnight." "I understood you were engaged to go to the masquerade." "So we shall, only we intend to see the masks at home first." "I have some thoughts," said Mr. Harrel, leading the way to another small room, "of running up a flight of steps, and a little light gallery here, and so making a little orchestra. What would such a thing come to, Mr. Tomkins?" "Oh, a trifle, sir," answered Mr. Tomkins, "a mere nothing." "Well, then, give orders for it, and let it be done directly. I don't care how slight it is, but pray let it be very elegant. Won't it be a great addition, Miss Beverley?" "Indeed, sir, I don't think it seems to be very necessary," said Cecilia, who wished much to take that moment for reminding him of the debt he had contracted with Mr. Arnott. "Lord, Miss Beverley is so grave," cried Mrs. Harrel. "Nothing of this sort gives her any pleasure." "She has indeed," answered Cecilia, trying to smile, "not much taste for the pleasure of being always surrounded by workmen." And as soon as she was able, she retired to her room, feeling, both on the part of Mr. Arnott and the Hills, a resentment at the injustice of Mr. Harrel, which fixed her in the resolution of breaking through that facility of compliance which had hitherto confined her disapprobation to her own breast, and venturing henceforward to mark the opinion she entertained of his conduct, by consulting nothing but reason and principle in her own. Her first effort towards this change was made immediately in begging to be excused from accompanying Mrs. Harrel to a large card assembly that evening. Mrs. Harrel, extremely surprised, asked 1,000 times the reason for her refusal, imagining it to proceed from some very extraordinary cause. nor was she without the utmost difficulty persuaded at last that she merely meant to pass one evening by herself. But the next day, when the refusal was repeated, she was still more incredulous. It seemed to her impossible that anyone who had the power to be encircled with company could by choice spend a second afternoon alone, and she was so urgent in her request to be entrusted with the secret that Cecilia found no way left to appease her but by frankly confessing she was weary of eternal visiting and sick of living always in a crowd. "Suppose, then," cried she, "I send for Miss Larolles to come and sit with you." Cecilia, not without laughing, declined this proposal, assuring her that no such assistant was necessary for her entertainment. Yet it was not till after a long contention that she was able to convince her there would be no cruelty in leaving her by herself. The following day, however, her trouble diminished, for Mrs Harrel, ceasing to be surprised, thought little more of the matter, and forbore any earnestness of solicitation, and from that time she suffered her to follow her own humour with very little opposition. Cecilia was much concerned to find her so unmoved, and not less disappointed at the indifference of Mr Harrel, who, being seldom of the same parties with his lady, and seeing her too rarely either to communicate or hear any domestic occurrences, far from being struck, as she had hoped, with the new way in which she passed the time, was scarce sensible of the change, and interfered not upon the subject. Sir Robert Floyer, who continued to see her when he dined in Portman Square, often inquired what she did with herself in an evening, but never obtaining any satisfactory answer, he concluded her engagements were with people to whom he was a stranger. Poor Mr Arnott felt the cruellest disappointment in being deprived of the happiness of attending her in an evening's expeditions, when, whether he conversed with her or not, he was sure of the indulgence of seeing and hearing her. But the greatest sufferer from this new regulation was Mr Monckton, who, unable any longer to endure the mortifications of which his morning visit to Portman Square had been productive, determined not to trust his temper with such provocations in future, but rather to take his chance of meeting with her elsewhere, for which purpose he assiduously frequented all public places, and sought acquaintance with every family and every person he believed to be known to the Harrels. But his patience was unrewarded, and his diligence unsuccessful. He met with her nowhere, and while he continued his search, fancied every evil power was at work to lead him whither he was sure never to find her. Meanwhile Cecilia passed her time greatly to her own satisfaction. Her first care was to assist and comfort the Hills. She went herself to their lodgings, ordered and paid for whatever the physician prescribed to the sick man, gave clothes to his children, and money and various necessaries to his wife. She found that the poor carpenter was not likely to languish much longer, and therefore for the present only thought of alleviating his sufferings by procuring him such indulgences as were authorized by his physician, and enabling his family to abate so much of their labour as was requisite for obtaining time to nurse and attend him. But she meant, as soon as the last duties should be paid to him, to assist his survivors in attempting to follow some better and more profitable business. Her next solicitude was to furnish herself with a well-chosen collection of books, and this employment, which to a lover of literature, young and ardent in its pursuit, is perhaps the mind's first luxury, proved a source of entertainment so fertile and delightful that it left her nothing to wish. She confined her acquisitions to the limits of her present power, but as she was laying in a stock for future as well as immediate advantage, she was restrained by no expense from gratifying her taste and her inclination. She had now entered upon the last year of her minority, and therefore had not any doubt that her guardians would permit her to take up whatever sum she should require for such a purpose. And thus, in the exercise of charity, the search of knowledge, and the enjoyment of quiet, serenely in innocent philosophy passed the hours of Cecilia. I wonder how long that will last. After all, tomorrow is a new chapter, and there was a mention in this chapter that we've just read of what might be to come, what great event we are to have tomorrow. And it's now been almost 40 minutes since I started reading, so I will bid you adieu. Good night.